The story begins in silence, not the ordinary stillness of a quiet night, but a silence so heavy that it presses down on your chest, a silence broken only by the distant call of a crow and the sighing wind that curls through endless forests. The Appalachian Mountains, stretching across the eastern spine of America, have long been a place of beauty, danger, and legend. But hidden deep within their folds lies a mystery that chills even the bravest explorers. Over the course of 27 years, 97 men, women, and children stepped into this wilderness and never returned. Their belongings were found, their camps remained intact, but their bodies, their very presence, seemed to dissolve into the air. The locals know the tale well. They whisper it in hushed tones around firelight, their faces flickering with shadows. They call it the settlement, a place once inhabited, now deserted, but never truly lifeless. They speak of narrow trails that vanish in the fog, of hollow homes where whispers echo, and of an unseen force that lingers, waiting. For some, it is cursed land. For others, it is a feeding ground. And for those who entered, it became their final resting place, or worse, something not even death can explain. Tonight we begin our descent into that darkness, a place where fact and folklore merge, where official reports collide with superstition, and where the line between the natural and the supernatural becomes impossible to trace. 97 people are gone, 97 stories untold, and the Appalachian settlement keeps its secrets locked in silence. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest mountain ranges in the world, stretching from Alabama to Canada, carved by time and nature into peaks, valleys, and endless green expanses. For centuries, they have been both sanctuary and prison. To early settlers, the dense forests promised land and survival, but they also harbored isolation, danger, and the unknown. Even now in modern times, these mountains retain an eerie hold over the imagination. This region is a patchwork of rugged trails, forgotten mining towns, and ghostly relics of communities that once thrived but eventually withered away. Some of these places became tourist attractions, celebrated for their history. Others, however, faded into obscurity, erased by time, until they were remembered only in whispers. One such place is the settlement at the heart of this mystery. Nestled far from main roads, unreachable without hours of trekking through thick undergrowth, the settlement remains untouched by modern hands. The houses are skeletal, roofs collapsing, windows broken, but the atmosphere is not one of decay, it is one of waiting. Step too close, and the forest grows still. Birds fall silent, even the air seems heavier, as if thick with secrets. The Appalachian Mountains hold countless legends, phantom miners, lost civilizations, and creatures lurking beyond the tree line. But none compare to the chilling reality tied to this hidden settlement. Over 27 years, people from all walks of life, hikers, campers, wanderers, passed through here. None returned. The mountains, it seems, swallowed them whole. The story of the settlement begins not with its vanishings, but with its rediscovery. In the late 1980s, a pair of hunters stumbled upon it by accident. They had been following deer tracks when the forest opened unexpectedly, revealing a cluster of decaying wooden houses. At first, they believed they had found one of the many ghost towns scattered through the Appalachians, remnants of coal mining days. But there was something different about this place. The hunters described an immediate unease, as though they were trespassing in a space that did not want them there. The structures were primitive, older than expected, some built with rough-hewn logs blackened with age. Tools still lay where they had last been used, rusted and half-buried in the earth. Chairs sat around empty tables. It looked less like a town abandoned gradually and more like one deserted in haste, as if its inhabitants had vanished overnight. When word spread, curious locals ventured into the area. Some returned with unsettling stories, shadows flitting across windows, voices whispering from inside houses, a sensation of being followed. Others who attempted to map the site found their equipment failing. Compasses spun erratically, radios went silent, and photographs came out distorted. The settlement seemed to resist being documented, as though it belonged to another time or another realm. What no one realized then was that this discovery marked the beginning of a new chapter in Appalachian folklore. From that moment on, people began to vanish. The first disappearance tied directly to the settlement occurred in 1988. His name was Michael Harris, a young college student fascinated by folklore. He had heard the stories from locals and decided to spend a weekend exploring the area with nothing but a tent, a journal, and his camera. He never returned. Search parties combed the forest for days. They found his campsite, his belongings neatly arranged, his journal open with the last entry reading, "The settlement feels alive, like it's breathing. I hear voices when the wind blows." But Michael himself was nowhere to be found. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, just emptiness. Authorities chalked it up to an accident. The Appalachians are treacherous after all, steep cliffs, wild animals, hidden caves. But Michael's family insisted otherwise. His notes described something strange, something watching him. To them, it was no accident. It was the beginning of something darker. Michael's case was filed, then forgotten. But within a year, 2 more hikers disappeared in the same region, and then another. The settlement's hunger, it seemed, had only just begun. By the early 1990s, the disappearances had multiplied. 20 people were gone in less than 10 years. They were not connected by age, gender, or background, only by the place they vanished. Campers, photographers, amateur historians, and families seeking adventure all entered the Appalachian settlement's shadow. None returned. Authorities struggled to explain the growing number of missing persons. They dispatched helicopters, search dogs, and rescue teams. Each time, the searches came up empty. What was most disturbing was the state of the camps left behind. Fires still burned low in fire pits. Food remained half-cooked. Backpacks lay unzipped as though their owners had simply stepped away for a moment and never came back. The families demanded answers. Was there a predator, a serial killer using the forest as a hunting ground, or was something else at work, something beyond human comprehension? Locals grew fearful. Trails near the settlement were abandoned, maps erased it from memory, and stories circulated of an invisible force pulling people deeper into the woods. The Appalachian settlement was no longer a forgotten relic. It was becoming a legend and a warning. The disappearances left more than empty campsites and cold trails. They left shattered families, mothers who never saw their sons again, fathers who refused to stop searching, children who grew up waiting for a parent who would never return. For them, the Appalachian settlement was not just a legend, it was a thief that stole pieces of their lives. In the early 1990s, missing posters lined gas stations and diners across the region. Black and white photographs smiled out from fading paper, names scrawled beneath with words like "last seen near the settlement." Candlelight vigils were held in small-town churches, voices trembling with prayers that grew more desperate as the years dragged on. Some families organized search parties themselves, refusing to accept law enforcement's silence. They pushed deeper into the woods than most dared to go, armed with flashlights, maps, and fading hope. Yet they returned empty-handed, often speaking of strange sensations, the feeling of being watched, the forest falling silent at once, as if holding its breath. Grief soon gave way to obsession. Some relatives became consumed with uncovering the truth. They collected stories, newspaper clippings, and whispers from locals. A few even moved closer to the mountains, unable to escape the pull of unanswered questions. For them, the settlement was not just a place, it was a black hole that dragged them into its orbit, swallowing not only the lost, but also those left behind. One mother, whose daughter vanished in 1993, wrote in her diary, "I dream of the forest. She is calling me from within, her voice soft but urgent. The settlement has her, and maybe, one day, it will take me too." As more vanishings occurred, investigators began to notice disturbing similarities in what was left behind. It was as if every victim had simply stepped away from reality, leaving their lives paused in place. At one site, a hiker's camera was discovered resting on a tree stump, lens cap off, film half used. The photos captured ordinary moments, trees, streams, shadows, but the final frame showed something chilling. In the blurred background just beyond the tree line, a figure stood, tall, indistinct, and watching. No one could say if it was a trick of light, but the families believed otherwise. Another case revealed a notebook filled with frantic handwriting. The victim, a young woman named Claire, wrote of hearing voices at night. She described them as layered whispers, like 10 people speaking at once, but none of them making sense. Her final entry read, "They are closer now. I don't think I'm alone." Claire was never found. Perhaps the most haunting discovery was a campsite where dinner still sat on plates, uneaten, though the fire had burned out long ago. To investigators, it felt less like people walked away and more like they were taken mid-action, pulled from existence in an instant. Every trail of evidence led to the same chilling truth. Something was happening in the settlement, something that erased lives but left their traces behind like cruel reminders. Search parties often reported a bizarre phenomenon: footprints, trails of them, crisp in the dirt or snow, leading deep into the forest. They always began clear, moving steadily toward the settlement, but without fail they ended abruptly, as if the person had vanished mid-step. No sign of turning back, no scuffle, just a sudden stop. One rescue worker recounted following the prints of a missing teenager. The steps grew more erratic, closer together as though the boy had started running. Then, nothing. The final print was sharp, the heel dug deep into the earth. Beyond it, only undisturbed leaves. Even more disturbing were the times when the footprints did not match the victims. Extra sets appeared alongside them. Strange, elongated impressions, sometimes barefoot, sometimes resembling boots of an older style, as though someone, or something, was walking with them, guiding them deeper. Experts tried to dismiss these findings as mistakes. Maybe the prints were covered by weather, or searchers had misread the ground, but locals who joined the hunts disagreed. To them, the footprints proved that no one walked into the settlement alone. Something walked with them, and only one set ever returned. Beyond missing persons and footprints, search teams documented strange phenomena that defied explanation. Compasses spun wildly, their needles turning in endless circles as though magnetized by some unseen force. Radios crackled with static. Even when rescue teams stood close together, GPS units failed to lock onto satellites, leaving rescuers stranded without orientation. The forest itself seemed to resist intrusion. Drones flown over the area lost connection and fell from the sky. Cameras returned distorted images, frames marred by streaks of light and shadowy blurs. One video captured by a police officer ended abruptly when his lens cracked without reason, though he swore nothing had touched it. And then, there was the silence. In most forests, even in still moments, life hums, birds call, insects buzz, leaves rustle. But in the settlement's shadow, silence dominates. Searchers often reported feeling as though they had stepped into a void, cut off from the world outside. Some described their own voices sounding muted, as though swallowed by unseen walls. To those who experienced it, the silence was not peaceful, it was oppressive. It was as if the land itself was aware of their presence and was waiting, for what? None dared to guess. Long before the disappearances, locals whispered that the settlement's land was cursed. Stories passed down through generations told of early settlers who clashed violently with the indigenous tribes who first inhabited the region. Blood soaked the soil, and with it came tales of retribution. Some say a dying curse was placed upon the land, that those who tried to claim it would never know peace, their descendants forever bound to the forest's hunger. Others point to the settlers themselves. Records suggest a small religious sect broke away from larger communities, choosing isolation in the Appalachian wilderness. They built the settlement not as a refuge, but as a sanctuary for rituals meant to keep them apart from the outside world. Strange symbols carved into tree trunks and stone remnants found near the site suggest that their practices were not entirely of Christian tradition. Folklore insists that these settlers bound their souls to the land through ceremony. In exchange for protection, they offered blood, animal, and perhaps human. When their community collapsed, the land did not forget its covenant. It waited, hungry, for new offerings. The modern vanishings, believers claim, are not random. They are the forest fulfilling its ancient pact, collecting lives to feed whatever lingers beneath the soil. Skeptics laugh at the idea, but for those who have lost loved ones, the curse offers an answer, however terrifying, to the question that haunts them most. Why here? The locals often whispered about a solitary man who lived on the outskirts of the settlement. His name rarely appeared in records, but stories spoke of him as the Keeper. With long white hair, a beard that brushed his chest, and a lantern he never seemed to extinguish, the Keeper was said to have lived in those mountains longer than anyone could remember. Some swore he was there before the settlement even existed, a relic of a time when only hunters and shamans walked the Appalachian trails. He was never seen in town, but residents noticed that he appeared on nights when someone went missing. His shadow lingered near the edges of farms, barns, and cabins, always too far to confront, but close enough to be unmistakable. Children feared his glowing lantern, calling it the soul light, believing it could lead the unsuspecting into the woods, never to return. The few who claimed to have spoken with him described a man who spoke in riddles, warning them of deals made in blood and land. Some believed the Keeper knew why the settlement was cursed, that he carried the truth no one dared face, yet no one asked too many questions because those who sought him out seemed to vanish within weeks. Was he a guardian, cursed to remain until the town's sins were cleansed? Or was he a harbinger of death, appearing only to mark his next victim? The keeper remained a mystery, and to this day his lantern is sometimes reported by hikers. A single, flickering light deep in the forest, moving where no path should be. At the heart of the abandoned settlement stood an old stone well, covered in moss and tangled vines. It was said that no matter how dry the summer or how harsh the winter, the well always remained filled with black water, reflecting the moon like a mirror. Parents warned their children never to lean too close, for those who did often swore they heard faint whispers rising from its depths. Not the echo of their own voices, but words spoken in a language they could not understand. Legend claimed that the well was older than the settlement, built by the land's original inhabitants, who believed it to be a sacred boundary between worlds. When settlers arrived, they ignored the warnings and used it as their main water source. Soon after, the disappearances began. Some said that the missing people were pulled down into the well, dragged screaming into the blackness below. Others believed their spirits lived at the bottom, eternally calling for more company. Strangest of all were the testimonies of searchers. When a family member vanished, loved ones often went to the well in desperation, listening for signs. More than one claimed to hear the voice of the missing person echoing back, pleading for help, begging to be rescued. But no rope lowered into the darkness ever came back with a body. Only the sound of splashing, followed by silence, as if something down there was swallowing everything offered to it. To this day, hikers say if you lean close enough, the whispers return. One of the settlement's strangest mysteries was the silent procession, a recurring phenomenon that terrified even the bravest locals. It was said that on certain moonless nights, witnesses would see a line of shadowy figures walking through the woods. They carried lanterns that glowed faintly green, and though their feet touched the ground, they made no sound at all. The figures were hooded, their faces obscured, and they always walked in single file toward the abandoned church at the center of the community. Residents described the procession as both mesmerizing and horrifying. Some watched from their windows, unable to move, as the shadows glided silently past. A few desperate souls followed, hoping the figures might lead them to their missing loved ones. None who followed were ever seen again. The most chilling detail was that many swore they recognized the figures. A husband would see his vanished wife among them, a child would see their missing father, and elders claimed the line was filled with every villager who had ever disappeared. Yet when the sun rose, there were no tracks, no lanterns, and no trace that anything had passed through the night before. The silent procession became a dreaded omen. If you saw it, it meant the settlement would soon lose another person. Some even believed the figures weren't just the lost souls of the missing, but a warning, a grim parade that came to collect the living. As the disappearances mounted, rumors spread that the settlement's founders had made a secret pact. The story claimed that when the settlers first arrived in the mountains, the land was harsh, the winters deadly, and the soil unforgiving. Desperate to survive, the leaders of the community sought the help of a wandering mystic who promised prosperity, but at a price. The agreement was simple. The land would provide crops, game, and safety from storms, but in return the settlement must feed the land with blood every year. The early years of prosperity seemed to confirm the pact's power. Crops flourished, winters grew milder, and the community thrived. But then, quietly and without announcement, people began to vanish. At first it was one every few years, then one every year, then multiple disappearances within months. The townsfolk whispered that the elders knew exactly what was happening but dared not interfere, for fear the entire settlement would collapse if the deal was broken. The pact theory explained why the missing were never found. They weren't lost, the whispers claimed. They were offerings. Some were chosen, others taken, but all fed the land's hunger. It was never random. The land demanded its share, and the settlement obeyed. The dark irony was that in trying to save themselves from starvation, the settlers had ensured their community would never truly be free. The soil thrived, but at the cost of human lives. At the center of the settlement stood a church, its steeple blackened with age, its doors nailed shut long before the town was abandoned. It had been the heart of the community, a place where settlers gathered to pray for protection. But as the vanishings increased, faith began to falter. Priests came and went, each leaving under mysterious circumstances. Some simply disappeared themselves, while others fled in the dead of night, refusing to speak of what had driven them away. Those who remained told of strange occurrences inside. Candles lit themselves at night. Hymn books opened on their own, always to passages about sacrifice and judgment. The bell in the steeple rang at midnight, though no one pulled the rope. The final straw came when parishioners claimed to see shadowed figures sitting in the pews during services, silent, unmoving, but undeniably present. Terrified, the townsfolk boarded the church shut, leaving it to rot. But even abandoned, the church seemed alive. Travelers who dared to break inside described the air as suffocating, filled with the stench of sulfur and damp earth. Faint chanting echoed in the rafters, though no choir was present. And always, etched into the pulpit, were claw-like scratches spelling words in no known language. Some believed this was the true heart of the curse, the place where the settlement's pact with darkness had been sealed, and so it stood, a black monument in the woods, waiting for its next congregation. The spring of 1942 should have been a season of renewal for the settlement, yet it became the stage for one of its most haunting episodes. Sheriff Amos Carter had been assigned to investigate the mysterious disappearances that plagued the region. He was not a man easily swayed by local legends or ghost stories. He prided himself on reason, law, and tangible evidence. Yet the files he carried told a different tale, a growing list of names stretching back decades, all tied to this isolated community in the Appalachian woods. Families gone without a trace, travelers who never reached their destination, and locals who seemed to vanish after dark. Sheriff Carter arrived with a determination that few before him possessed, but it would be his final case. The sheriff's last known night was pieced together from fragmented witness accounts. Locals remembered the echo of his boots on the wooden boards of the settlement's narrow street. He was seen questioning an elderly woman who muttered warnings about the watchers in the trees. Another recalled the sheriff standing at the edge of the woods, staring into the endless black, his lantern flickering against the wind. He had spoken of searching the old coal shaft, an abandoned mine that, according to whispered rumors, was more than a relic of industry. Some said the shaft was a place where shadows moved like water and voices rose from beneath the earth. When morning came, Sheriff Carter's horse wandered back into town without its rider. The saddle was intact, but the leather reins had been slashed clean through. His lantern was later found at the mouth of the mine, shattered, with traces of soot but no flame. The shaft itself seemed to swallow sound, as though it led to an emptiness far deeper than stone. Deputies and townsfolk who attempted to enter spoke of nausea, confusion, and a sense of being watched by something vast and unseen. No one dared descend beyond the first chamber. Sheriff Carter was never found, his badge lost to the darkness. The irony of his fate was not lost on the people. A man who sought to bring order to a lawless mystery became one of its victims, another name scrawled in the ledger of the vanished. His disappearance marked a turning point in the settlement story. Authorities outside the mountains quietly closed the case, unwilling to allocate more resources to a town cursed with shadows. Locals, however, remembered Carter with hushed reverence. Some claimed his ghost now roamed the tree line, still investigating, his lantern light flickering between the trunks on storm-heavy nights. The sheriff had come to solve a puzzle, but in the end he became part of it, swallowed by the same force he had once mocked. The settlement's small wooden church had once been its anchor, a place where prayers were offered against the storms of mountain life. But by the 1940s its walls echoed less with hymns and more with whispers. The congregants were dwindling not just because of the vanishings, but because of the fear that something unholy had infected the house of God. The pastor who once preached salvation had left years earlier after confessing that he saw shadowy figures moving among the pews during evening prayers. The church stood abandoned, yet the locals swore it was never truly empty. Those who lived nearby reported hearing strange noises at night, wooden pews dragging across the floor, the organ playing faint notes despite its pipes having long rusted shut. Children spoke of lights glowing from the windows, a dim, reddish hue that pulsed like a heartbeat. Hunters claimed they saw movement inside, though no one dared step through the warped doors to confirm it. For years, the church remained a place the townspeople avoided, even during funerals. Graves were dug hastily, prayers whispered outside rather than beneath its roof. In 1946, a group of young men, emboldened by drink and curiosity, decided to test the rumors. They broke into the church one stormy night, laughing as the thunder shook the wooden beams. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of mold and something metallic. The altar had collapsed years earlier, but on the floor beneath it, the men discovered carvings in the wood. Strange symbols, spirals, and runes that no one could identify. Some resembled old Appalachian folk signs meant to ward off evil. Others looked far older, etched deep with unsettling precision. Their laughter quieted when the organ groaned. At first it was only a single note, low and trembling, but then the air filled with a dreadful melody. The men swore the keys pressed themselves down. One by one, as though guided by invisible hands, they fled into the rain, terrified, swearing never to return. By morning, only 3 of them remained. The 4th, Eli Parsons, was gone. His jacket was found near the church steps, soaked through, but there were no footprints leading away. The church became known as the settlement's heart of dread. Stories spread of figures sitting in the pews during moonless nights, as though holding a silent service. Some believed the building itself was cursed, a gateway for whatever darkness plagued the town. Others whispered that the vanishings were tied to it, that names were spoken within those walls, and when the last echo of prayer faded, the chosen were taken. To this day, the church stands as a monument of absence, its bell long silent but its presence impossibly loud in the minds of those who remember. In 1951, an event shook the settlement like no other. For decades, people had vanished without a trace, but none had ever come back, until a man stumbled into town one summer evening, gaunt and wide-eyed, his clothes tattered and his lips cracked from thirst. His name was Samuel Griggs, a trapper who had disappeared 15 years earlier. His sudden reappearance was both a miracle and a nightmare, for what Samuel brought with him was not salvation, but terror. At first, townsfolk rushed to him with relief. They had believed him long dead, another victim of the mountain's hunger. But as Samuel was led into the tavern, his eyes darted to every corner, following things no one else could see. His words spilled out in fragments, describing years spent in a place that was not a place, where the sky was the color of ash and the trees whispered in voices that belonged to neither man nor beast. He spoke of tunnels beneath the earth, endless and shifting, where shadows crawled across the walls like living things. He claimed he had heard the voices of the other vanished, pleading, crying, some begging to be left alone. The townsfolk wanted to believe he was merely delirious, scarred by isolation and hunger. But then Samuel began to name them. Every person who had disappeared, he recited in order, including those lost after his own vanishing. He described their clothes, their final moments, the way they had been pulled into the dark. His knowledge was too precise, too impossible to dismiss. Some whispered that Samuel had made a pact with the very thing that haunted them, and his return was part of a cruel design. His body bore marks that deepened the dread, scars that ran in perfect spirals down his arms, as if carved with a blade not meant for human hands. His back was branded with a symbol eerily similar to the ones found beneath the church altar. The settlement's healer tended to him, but Samuel's health never returned. Within weeks he grew weaker, refusing food, whispering constantly about the things that still followed. On his final night, a storm tore across the mountains. Samuel was heard screaming, his voice raw and desperate, begging to be hidden. By morning, his bed was empty. The window of the small cabin where he stayed had been forced open, the frame splintered outward as though something had pulled him back into the night. Samuel Griggs had vanished a second time, and this time no one expected him to return. His brief reappearance left the community more fearful than ever. If the mountains could give back their lost, only to reclaim them, then there was no safety, no escape. Samuel's words haunted them. "It doesn't take us, it calls us." By the mid-1950s, the settlement was surrounded by more rumor than reality. Yet those who remained knew one truth above all others: the forest itself seemed alive. Travelers described an unsettling phenomenon, the sense that every tree, every moss-draped limb, every shadowed hollow was aware. The deeper one went into the woods, the stronger the sensation grew, as though unseen eyes lingered just beyond sight. The locals no longer called it the forest, they called it the Watcher. Hunting parties reported their traps being dismantled overnight, though no human footprints marked the soil. Campfires burned low while untouched, as if the flames themselves had been suffocated. Birds fell silent in unison, leaving an oppressive quiet that made men clutch their rifles tighter. The forest seemed to breathe in rhythm with those who entered, inhaling as they did, exhaling in long, dreadful sighs that rustled the leaves. Some even claimed the trees shifted positions overnight, realigning themselves into patterns that mirrored the spirals carved on Samuel Griggs' flesh and the church altar. One chilling account came from a logger named Mason Hill. Tasked with cutting timber near the ridge, Mason struck his axe into a massive oak. When the blade bit deep, a sound erupted, not the crack of wood, but a low moan, pained and resonant. Terrified, Mason fled, leaving his axe embedded in the trunk. Days later, he returned to find the axe gone and the tree scarless, as though it had healed. His story spread through the town, adding to the mounting belief that the forest was not simply cursed, but conscious. The vanishings often began at the forest's edge, children lured by strange laughter, men chasing the sound of weeping, women pulled toward ghostly lantern lights that flickered between the trunks. Each disappearance was blamed not on the people themselves, but on the watcher. The settlement came to view the forest not as land, but as a predator, patient, unrelenting, and eternal. They spoke of it the way sailors spoke of the sea, with respect, fear, and the understanding that it could never be conquered. It was said that if you stood at the tree line too long, you would see them. Faces, pale and blurred, staring back from the bark. Not reflections, not tricks of light, but imprints of the lost. 97 souls trapped within the wood. Whether this was truth or legend hardly mattered. What mattered was that the watcher remained, vast and silent, waiting for the next to step into its gaze. By 1960, the settlement had been hollowed out by fear. Families moved away in the dead of night, their wagons packed with what little they could carry. Crops rotted in fields left untended, homes decayed beneath sagging roofs, and the once bustling tavern fell silent. The government, perhaps recognizing the futility of maintaining a community in a place so cursed, declared the area unsafe for habitation. Officials cited economic decline and hazardous conditions from abandoned mines, but those who lived there knew better. The settlement had been surrendered to the darkness. The evacuation was not orderly. Those who remained were stubborn souls, unwilling to leave behind generations of history. But even they, one by one, were driven out by the whispers, the vanishings, and the overwhelming silence. The final family to depart was the Hargroves, a husband and wife with 2 children. They left on a cloudless morning, carrying only essentials. Yet as they passed the church, the youngest child cried out, insisting she saw people standing inside, waving goodbye. The parents hurried on, too afraid to look. When authorities returned weeks later, the settlement was empty. Doors swung open on rusted hinges, and the forest had already begun to reclaim the streets. The church loomed as it always had, windows dark, symbols etched deep within. The tally of the vanished stopped at 97, a grim number that would never change. Some said the settlement's sacrifice had been complete, that the watcher had taken its due. Others whispered that the darkness simply waited for the day the count would rise again. Though the community was gone, its legend endured. Travelers avoided the area, but stories spread beyond the mountains, whispered in bars, and recounted by old-timers at campfires. They spoke of a place that swallowed not just people, but entire generations, leaving behind only echoes of screams and shadows between trees. The final evacuation was not a victory, it was a retreat. The settlement had been abandoned, not because its people were weak, but because no one could fight an enemy that had no face, no body, and no end. The Appalachian settlement became a ghost town, not of buildings, but of memories. 97 people had vanished in 27 years. The rest had fled, but the mountain remained, silent and patient. And in that silence, something still watched. The storm outside the Ashford estate raged with a fury that seemed unnatural, as if the very skies had been summoned to witness the family's final reckoning. Within the crumbling halls, the surviving descendants gathered in the ancestral chamber, each face drawn tight with fear, guilt, and desperation. The walls, once adorned with grandeur, now bled with the stains of water and rot. Shadows writhed unnaturally, as though invisible figures stood in silent judgment. At the center of the room stood the great mirror, its frame gilded in blackened gold, the same mirror rumored to hold the souls of the Ashford dead. Its surface pulsed faintly, as though breathing. The descendants could no longer deny the curse. The air pressed down on them, thick with ancestral rage. Whispers filled the chamber, dozens of voices layered over one another, chanting in a language none could decipher. Their collective weight bore into the ears of the living until blood trickled from their nostrils. Each descendant was forced to confront a vision in the mirror. Betrayals, murders, forbidden rituals, and madness, all carried out by those who bore their name. The sins of the Ashfords were not forgotten. They were recorded in flesh and blood, etched into the very marrow of their lineage. One by one, they began to break, screaming, sobbing, clawing at themselves as if to peel away the curse clinging to their skin. But the mirror offered no mercy. It demanded payment. The ritual began without a word spoken, as if guided by unseen hands. Candles flared, though none had been lit, casting the chamber in a flickering crimson glow. The air thickened with the scent of iron, of old blood. The floor beneath the Ashfords began to tremble, symbols etched into the stone glowing faintly before splitting open, as though veins of the earth itself were exposed. The curse demanded sacrifice. One life for each sin committed, one drop of blood for each betrayal that had rotted the family from within. The surviving Ashfords felt their bodies move against their will, knives pressed into their palms, edges glinting in the unnatural light. Fear consumed them, but so too did compulsion. The voices of their ancestors grew louder, commanding obedience, urging violence. One descendant fell to their knees, screaming that they would not give in. The others turned, their eyes glazed with the same black sheen that had claimed so many Ashfords before. In a frenzy, they descended on the defiant, their blades flashing, their screams mingling with laughter not their own. The sacrifice was made, but it was not enough. The ground drank deeply, yet the mirror's hunger was not sated. It wanted more, always more. The Ashfords realized the truth too late. The curse had no end. It could only consume. The walls of the estate shook violently, as though the house itself were being torn apart from the inside. Dust rained from the ceiling, portraits crashed to the ground, their painted eyes shattered into nothingness. But it was the sound that froze the blood of the Ashfords, the sound of footsteps. Dozens, hundreds of footsteps. They echoed through the halls, heavy and deliberate, yet no living soul walked them. The dead had risen. From the darkness of the corridor, shapes began to emerge, skeletal figures draped in tattered remnants of finery, fleshless jaws stretched wide in mockery of laughter. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, the same crimson light that pulsed in the mirror. These were the Ashfords of centuries past, bound forever to their sins, returned to drag the living into the abyss. Their movements were slow but unstoppable, filling the chamber until every corner of the room was crowded with their presence. The living Ashfords fought desperately, but knives could not pierce the dead, and screams could not drown out the endless chanting that surrounded them. Hands of bone and rot clawed at their throats, their faces, their very souls. The chamber became a slaughterhouse, the air thick with blood and terror. Yet amidst the chaos, the mirror gleamed brighter, its surface rippling as if waiting to receive its final victims. Among the survivors, only one remained untouched by the frenzy. A child, barely 12, hidden in the shadows of the chamber. Wide-eyed and trembling, they clutched a locket bearing the Ashford crest, unaware that it was the very key to their family's damnation. The dead ignored the child, their hollow gazes fixed only on the adults, tearing and feasting until silence fell once more. The child stepped forward, lured by the glow of the mirror. Whispers softened, beckoning them closer, promising peace, promising freedom. But the locket grew hot against their skin, searing them until they cried out. In that instant, the mirror's surface shuddered violently. The spirits within recoiled, screaming, their voices twisting into rage. The locket had been forged generations ago as the one safeguard, a relic of defiance against the curse. With trembling hands, the child lifted the locket, holding it before the mirror. Light erupted from the small charm, blinding and pure, a light the Ashfords had not seen in centuries. The mirror cracked, its surface splintering like ice beneath a heavy weight. The voices howled in fury, the walls shook, and the estate itself began to collapse. The curse resisted, clawing at the child's mind, urging surrender. But the child stood firm, tears streaming, voice breaking as they screamed into the void. No more. The mirror shattered, exploding into 1,000 shards that scattered across the chamber. Each fragment hissed as though alive, dissolving into dust before they could touch the ground. The screams of the dead filled the estate, rising in a crescendo before cutting off into suffocating silence. The crimson glow faded, leaving only the natural flicker of storm lightning through broken windows. The Ashford curse was broken, or so it seemed. The estate collapsed around the child, stone and wood groaning as if in mourning. Yet they walked unscathed through the wreckage, guided by a strange calm. Outside, the storm quieted, revealing a pale dawn creeping over the horizon. For the first time in centuries, the Ashford lands were silent, free of whispers. But as the child turned one last time, their eyes caught the faint glimmer of something half buried in the ruins, a shard of the mirror, untouched by dust, still pulsing faintly with crimson light. The locket grew heavy in their hand, the warmth fading, replaced by a cold dread. Though the curse had been shattered, its remnants endured, waiting for another generation, another soul to awaken it. The story of the Ashfords was not one of redemption, but of survival, of terror that lingered even in victory. And as the child vanished into the world beyond, one thing was certain: the Ashfords would never truly die.